back, relax, and maybe get yourself a snack. Me and you gonna have a little chat about books. Hey guys! So I have two books today that I want to review for you. Both of them are non-fiction, although one is a little bit more fun and quirky and the other one is a lot more in-depth, interesting, thought-provoking. So the first one I have to show you is this one, which is the Quirky One, The Science of Game of Thrones by Helen Keane. The second one I have to show you is So You've Been Publicly Shamed, which is by Jon Ronson, and I listened to the audiobook of this one, and I was recommended this by Max from Well Done Books, so thank you to him. So let's start off with this one, which is the Quirky One. I was sent this one for review. If you don't already know, I do really like Game of Thrones, both the TV show and the books. I read the books before the TV show, but I really like the TV show too. I think it's a lot of fun and I do watch it and I think it's enjoyable. So I was definitely intrigued about this book because it kind of debunks some of the things that happen in Game of Thrones and tells you whether or not it would be possible. The interesting thing about this book is it mostly focuses on the TV show, I would say. There's some reference to some of the things that happen in the books and not in the TV show, but most of the time it talks about the TV show. Inside we have little illustrations every now and then, which kind of help to illustrate points, and I like that. We also have different formatting on each page, so some pages have this box around them, and some don't, and it kind of separates out the different chapters. So it's an interesting format. In terms of the facts within this, I think some of them were really good and some of them were a little bit subpar. I think the first half of the book and the ending of the book I struggled with, but the middle section I really, really liked because there were certain things in the middle section that appealed to me a lot more. We find out things about how likely it would be that you could melt a crown and put it on someone's head and kill them, which it's not very likely in a campfire, I'll spoil you there. And we also find out a lot more about wildfire, whether there's a real life alternative or real life comparison to that, which there is. We find out about interbreeding and about some of the animals that are used within there, and I think it's an interesting look. Like, some of the things are definitely interesting. The problem I had with this book was that although it was a very likeable, easy read, it's the sort of book you could easily give to someone who doesn't read a huge amount or doesn't know much about science or is just interested in Game of Thrones. Like, those three things, I think it would be a good gift. If you do know about science, if you've studied a basic science thing in school, then I think you're already going to know some of the things within this. I only studied science up to age 16. I didn't study it at college and I didn't study it at university. I just did my GCSE in science. I did all three, biology, chemistry and physics, but I didn't do a huge amount of science. Like, I only took it through school. And I already knew a fair amount about some of the things within this. So some of the things that were talked about were repetition for me. I mean, I hadn't learned about them in a long time, so it was like a refresher course, but some of it was just common sense as well. Some of it I think you wouldn't have even had to study science to know. Some people would just know it. So it's an interesting mix. I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I do think it's easy to get into. I think the humour is a little bit hit and miss, shall we say. Some bits I laughed at and some bits I was like, rolled my eyes. So it's a bit of an interesting one. It's probably not for everyone, but I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars because I definitely liked it. I definitely think there were bits that were really, really good, but there were also some bits that just didn't quite hit that 4-star mark, so I gave it 3. I'd love to hear if you guys are going to pick it up though. The second book that I have is So You've Been Publicly Shamed, which, as I say, I listened to the audiobook of this and I'm very glad I did because I think the audiobook was a good way to go. This book deals with internet shaming. It talks about public places like Twitter where shaming has become a real problem. What I mean by shaming is someone who is maybe unknown or someone who says something that shouldn't have been said, probably was worded in the wrong way or said something that was controversial. People who do this and then for some reason, whatever that may be, this tweet blows up, people retweet it, people get angry, people harass this person. It becomes a public shaming, essentially. And this has happened in the booktube community. I've seen it happen a couple times. I've also seen it happen in other communities online. And it definitely seems to happen on Twitter most of the time. I don't see it so much in other places, but Twitter seems to be the place for this sort of outburst of public outcry against a person who they may not have known before, or they may have just come across, or someone who just tweeted something. This book looks at a few different cases. We follow a young man who is a reporter who plagiarises, and he gets found out, and because of that he gets publicly shamed. We also follow a young woman who tweets something that is kind of disrespectful before she gets on a flight, but actually it was kind of intended as a joke. It wasn't a great joke, let's be honest, it wasn't a great joke because it's about AIDS, but it was a joke, and she gets on a flight and she flies off, and she, while she's on this flight, gets a huge amount of abuse, like torrents and torrents of abuse online. Both of these people have to stop their jobs and cannot carry on working because of how bad the internet shaming gets for them. He also goes and looks at sort of the past shaming, so we talk about whippings and lynchings and things that happened in the past, like stockades. These were all public shaming things that used to happen in Britain and various other places around the world. If someone did a petty crime, then they would be put in the stockades and people would be able to throw things at them. That was a public shaming. But as time went on, we kind of decided that we were not going to continue with public shamings, and I think most of the world is in agreement there. So we stopped public shamings, but we haven't stopped online shaming. Online shaming is a real problem that is kind of growing in our society rather than shrinking. So I think it's a really interesting comparison between the older style of shame and the newer style. And the thing about shame is it can be worse for people to be shamed than it can for them to actually get hurt, like physically, to be beaten up or something like that. And so shame is a very, very powerful tool, and it can really, really ruin people's lives. And the other thing that's interesting is if you were put in the stockades back in the day, or if you were whipped, you were considered to have had your punishment. By the time you were done with however many whippings or however long you needed to be there, you were considered done and it was over and that was it. Like, that was your punishment. Whereas on today's situation online, nothing is ever deleted. Everything you put out onto the online space is going to be there for a very long time, particularly if it gets screenshotted by people and retweeted by people. There's nothing you can do. That's a runaway train. So things live on in the digital age a lot longer than they would if we'd been back in the medieval times. People forgive and forget back then. I mean, it was a brutal time to live in for other reasons, but it's still brutal today. And some people who get internet harassment to the point that these people do, it can really ruin their lives. And basically the author, John Ronson, is a reporter who goes around interviewing people who've been through a public shaming online, and he talks to them about why it happened, he talks about why their situation blew up, and he talks to them about how their life has been affected, which usually is not in a good way. It's definitely something that I found fascinating, and I think it wasn't even something I'd ever considered. I personally tend to stay away from online controversy if I can. I don't like to get involved in that sort of thing because I find that it tends to spiral into crazy, out of control stuff, which I'm just not really into. But I definitely have seen it happen in the past to people that are on BookTube, to people who are not on BookTube. It's definitely been something that has happened and has sparked controversy. There's a lot of reasons why people get to the point where they are hounded online, but often it starts as a small thing that could have easily been forgiven if no one important had retweeted it or something like that. So I'm very interested in sort of the spiralling of a small thing into a massive thing, and I think this book deals a lot with that. He also does some crazy things to do some research, so there are some moments where he does some quite wacky techniques for embracing shame, and yeah, it's a bit weird, this book, but I really enjoyed it overall, and I definitely had fun listening to the audiobook. I think the audiobook was narrated really well, so I would recommend it. I think it's a fun one. I've never read any of his other books, but I'm definitely intrigued to sort of find out a bit more about them and see if any of the others appeal to me, because I think his writing style was quite easy to get into. So yeah, I definitely enjoyed this one. I think this was definitely a better read for me than the Game of Thrones book, just because it was so interesting to think about something I hadn't really considered that much. Like, I knew about it, but I hadn't thought about it or why it happened or examples of that. So yeah, it was really interesting and I'm very happy I read it. So I gave that one a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I'd love to hear your thoughts on both of those books that I've just mentioned. Whether one or other of them appeals to you, do let me know. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video very soon. Bye!
Thank you for watching my video today. Go pick up a book, then come back and chat with me again.